Well, obviously, I've been following it. There's two possibilities. It's either a natural virus that has evolved naturally, or it's escaped in some way from a laboratory.
Now, it could have been deliberately.
Yes, but when I say it's escaped from a laboratory, it could have been deliberately planted. Now, there's a very good article on Mint Press by Whitney Webb about this, and these laboratories in Wuhan have actually got contracts with US multinationals. Now, I can't remember all the detail off the top of my head.
Well, that's normal. That's what China does.
Right,
it trades.
That's right. But of course, if you were a US military intelligence operation, one of the things that would be very important for you at this moment is for China to have a coronavirus just on the Lunar New Year, just as they are trying to sign this trade deal, which isn't going to happen, just as you push up the stress and pressure in the South China Sea, just as you've been pushing people in Hong Kong to try and undermine the central government, and the same with the Uyghur issue. I'm not saying there aren't issues here, but there is definitely a desire to take China down. If you look at the internal discussions inside the US military establishment, they're definitely talking in terms of we've got to take China now, because if we leave it much longer, they're going to be able to overcome us. So there's got to be suspicion, at the very least, of foul play here. And you'd think, well, in that case, the Chinese government would scream from the rooftops, this is foul play. They wouldn't, because one of the interesting things about this is the time lag on the virus. It takes 10 to 14 days before people show symptoms. In other words, it looks like it's been... most flus, you start getting it at the same time as you're infected. Now, I'm not saying that this is what that, but there's one strand of the onion will be saying, well, it's escaped from these laboratories. The government's embarrassed about that, and that's why they've tried to keep it all quiet. A higher level than that would be it is, in fact, biowarfare. And I've just sent you earlier today a report that came out about biowarfare by the US in Korea in the 1950s. And they basically dropped loads of biological weaponry all over North Korea. That's what they did. That's what they did back in the day. And if you think they've changed, or they're better people than they were then, you're deluded.
What, were they dropping something to test weapons to see how fast... Martin, just let me finish the sentence. To test some sort of biological agent to see how quickly it spread? Or were these live, deadly illnesses they were spreading?
It was biological warfare to try and mess up their enemies. And that's what they did. And, of course, it's been uncovered by the really good Bulgarian journalists that they've got a biowarfare lab in Georgia. And they were going around all in Russia collecting DNA from Russian people. And eventually, the same thing happened in China, and they were kicked out by the authorities. Why are you doing that? They're trying to engineer viruses which are genetically focused, so you can kill just black people. Just Chinese people.
But as I understood it, the Israelis were the centre for this, with world expertise on genetically targeted viruses.
Well, the guy who said that I've forgotten his name, the Israeli specialist on this, who said, oh, this is probably biowarfare by the Chinese, he was very involved in the whole idea of Saddam Hussein's WDM. Now, there's a lot of detail to people to get through there, but if they're interested, they should read Whitney Webb's article about it, and she shows the linkages between Darpa and other Pentagon-related organisations and these laboratories.
Can I just give you the name? It's Danny Shoham, former Israeli, Shoham, former Israeli military intelligence officer who studied Chinese biowarfare. He said that the institute is linked to Beijing's covert biological weapons program, but he would say that, wouldn't he?
Well, he would. You see, what you do if you are a Western bio warrior is you wait for your moment, like Chinese New Year, just as the negotiations about various things are coming to a head, and then you introduce it. You introduce your virus right close to where these centres are.
But then you might also say, well, it's normal. People get flus in the winter.
Then that is perfectly logical and possible. All of these things are speculations. Right? It may be that this is just a virus which has mutated, and then we're going to have to deal with it, and it's nobody's fault, it's just stuff. That's perfectly logical, but it's not necessarily true. And if something else is true, then we've got to start thinking about who's doing what. And I would suggest to you that the people who are really pushing biological warfare and have been pushing it for years, have been pretending to research it in order to prevent things happening, they are definitely the Western powers. The Russian biological and chemical warfare stuff was dismantled completely in the 1990s under agreements. It was all based in Uzbekistan, where Craig Murray was our ambassador, and he said, I went round, they dismantled a lot. They basically regard the West as rogue players. And they are right, because they are.
Well, the Western media have already staked out their claim to the fundamentals. I mean, this is some info that I got this week from a doctor. The actual origin has not been determined or stated by the authorities and is still an open question, perhaps similarly since viruses seldom jump species barrier without any human assistance. So this idea that it's going to go from a snake to a pig to a cow to a bat to a bird to a human, it doesn't normally do that. And so there's a degree of, well, we're just being told this has come from a bat, and maybe it hasn't. So, but anyway, almost immediately on receiving the actual genome sequence from the Chinese, Russian scientists suggested a link between the SARS virus and biowarfare. This is back in the previous outbreak. Sergei Koznikov, a member of the Russian Academy of Medical Sciences, said the propagation of the SARS virus might well have been caused by leaking a combat virus, they called, which is grown in bacteriological weapons labs. According to a number of news reports, Koneslikov claimed that the virus of atypical pneumonia, SARS, was a synthesis of two viruses of measles and infectious parasititis or mumps. So, there is some evidence, at least from the Russian scientists, saying, well, we believe that this could easily have been engineered.
Well, indeed, and of course we know that the Cubans, for example, we know from Freedom of Information requests that they were definitely dropping all sorts of stuff on Cuba. They've been working on this stuff for years. Meanwhile, pointing the finger, oh, the Russians are doing this, the Chinese are doing this, oh, they're terrible. And in actual fact, they've been doing it all along. And, of course, what you do is it's such a slow-running virus that you don't, if you put something that killed everybody immediately, then it would be pretty obvious that it was a biological warfare attack. But if you can engineer the virus so that it creeps through any attempts to try and stop it, so that, you don't, there's quite a long incubation period. And the other thing is then, of course, you gradually, basically, the stock market in China has started to wobble. And the idiotic idea in Washington and in London is that if we can crash the Russian and Chinese economies, that will teach them a lesson. Although, of course, we will follow them into the black hole.
Okay, so recent disease outbreaks, this is from this article. I'll put a link up to it on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. Sharing stuff that seems pretty credible. This does. Recent disease outbreaks that would seem to possibly qualify as potential biowarfare agents are AIDS, SARS, MERS, bird flu, swine flu, hantavirus, Lyme disease, West Nile virus, Ebola, Syrian polio, foot and mouth disease, the Gulf War syndrome, and Zika. And in fact, thousands of prominent scientists, physicians, virologists, and epidemiologists on many continents have concurred that many of these viruses were lab-created and that their release was deliberate. Recent swine flu epidemic in China has the hallmarks. Sorry?
I was going to mention the swine flu. That's a bit of a given. Well, swine flu, the Chinese pig herd has just died off from African swine fever. And it's 90%.
Hence Macron is over there trying to sell Chinese people French pork.
Yeah, well, you'll understand that the Chinese Communist Party are a bit long in the tooth. And they didn't stay in power all these years by being stupid. And they know what's being done to them.
In the noughties, the swine flu epidemic this one particularly, the actual swine flu epidemic amongst pigs has the hallmarks as well, with circumstantial evidence of the outbreak raising questions. It wasn't widely reported, but seemed the final conclusion of the Chinese biochemists was the same, that the SARS virus also was probably man-made.
Well, there's a retired Chinese admiral who is outspoken about all of this. I've forgotten his name. But, of course, the Chinese as a whole say nothing. So, you see, part of what they're trying to do there is create panic in the population. If you turn around and say, in actual fact, we think this is a biowarfare attack and it's really dangerous, everybody's going to panic. So they have to, from their point of view, they've got to talk it down. But, of course, they then start thinking, right, what are we going to do not to get mad, to get even? And that's war talk, isn't it?
Yeah, especially it does create ferment within the population if it looks as if the authorities can't cope with the situation. But it may just be a natural outbreak. What's your conclusion from what you've heard, Kevin?
Well, playing biowarfare is dangerous because the viruses, if you put them into spectrometers and things, have fingerprints. And it's not impossible to figure it, with really advanced techniques. But the other thing none of us pay any attention to is we have biolabs in this country at Porton Down, and everything that humans do is subject to errors and mistakes. And biolabs handling really dangerous material are probably not safe. I don't think they're safe.
Also, Zero Hedge were suspended from Twitter for publishing an article saying, "Is this the man behind the global coronavirus pandemic?" And maybe he is, maybe he's not. There's a question mark at the end of the sentence, but Twitter still decided that this was a good reason to suspend Zero Hedge. In light of the growing speculation, the article said, most of it within less than official circles, the official theory and the spread of the coronavirus epidemic, someone ate bat soup at a Wuhan seafood and animal market was the beginning of it. What do you make of this, Martin? Zero Hedge actually being suspended for speculating. Now, this guy that they've pointed the finger at is the head of one of these biological labs in Wuhan. And, I mean, they're not saying he's done it, but they're saying, look, here is the bloke that's in charge of the lab. At least talk about the lab. And maybe, I mean, it seems to me like that's a decent bit of investigative journalism.
Yep.
It is, and of course, don't forget, if the whole thing is an elaborate psychological warfare operation, you choose to do it in Wuhan because you know that's where the Chinese labs are, and if they've actually got contracts with Darpa. Whitney Webb's done very good research into the links of these labs with the US military-industrial complex, and of course, if you've got people on the inside, they can release the virus, which then makes the Chinese government look bad, and then whatever they do is going to be... If it comes out in the end that Western intelligence services and their hench people have done this, how wicked is that?
But it's a fait accompli, isn't it? The thing often happens is, well, it takes months and months, or maybe even years to discover something, and in the meantime you get the geopolitical result you wanted.
That's why they do it, Tony.
I'm thinking about things like the Gupta chemical weapons attack.
Well, indeed, which has been debunked completely by the actual people on the ground who went to Gupta, and they said, well, there was no evidence of a chemical weapons attack, but you can tell, bet your bottom dollar, that all the people in Parliament, apart from a few brave souls, believed that there was a chemical weapons attack, even though there wasn't. And it's actually the white helmets, which are the Russians have been flagging up there's going to be another one. They've already made the video.
I saw
in Idlib.
that, for Idlib. That was fascinating. I haven't seen the white helmets on the Channel 4 News.
Well, no,
they've been largely discredited.
Was it? Here we go.
Yeah, the white helmets were on Channel 4 yesterday. It was the main story.
Well, there you go. So they're preparing all of this stuff all the time. Now, the fact is, what we know about Western intelligence services is that they do engage in all kinds of very, very nefarious psychological warfare. The bombing of Bologna railway station,
but this isn't just psychological. This is not just psychology, Martin. This is killing hundreds of people.
Yes, but psychological warfare involves killing people, but it involves killing people in order to create panic, in order to get effects. It's not just brainwashing. There's a whole, they see themselves as very, very sophisticated operators, and that we've now got, with the internet, access to loads and loads of stuff is out there for people to look at. And frankly, they should know this. Imposimato was the head of the Italian Supreme Court, wrote a book that came out in 2012 accusing NATO intelligence services of orchestrating all the terrorism in Italy in the 60s, 70s and 80s. All of it. Run from shape in Brussels. And he knew that because of the investigations which he led by the Italian police force into NATO's intelligence services.
So the update
killed hundreds of people. That's who they are.
Coronavirus is today 638 deaths, 4 from the Royal Caribbean ship in Bayonne, which is to undergo testing. And this is itself a rather chilling effect of all of this, Kevin, is that people have been told you've got to stay on this ship, and meanwhile some of the people are actually catching it on the ship.
Yeah, that looks really bad, the stuff on the ship. But you're slightly skipping the fact that there are at least 3 cases in the UK, confirmed cases. And I suspect, there's terrific traffic between China and the UK. And we are going to have, I think, a serious problem. And one thing that puzzles me, though, is SARS was in 2003, and even the disease center in Atlanta wasn't saying definitely it had been traced to bats and camels. It might have been, but 17 years later, don't you think they could have worked it out?
Okay, apparently.
Why the long delays in the science?
The Brits, the third UK patient who's got this, caught it in Singapore. So people are being asked to self-isolate. The initial advice only covered mainland China. Don't go there, basically, the British government's saying. But that now includes Thailand, Japan, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong and Macau. So you can go, but they're saying if you're doing it at your own risk.
Yeah, well, if you think of the economic effects of this are potentially going to be disastrous, even if it isn't particularly, it doesn't look as deadly as it might be. You know, quite a lot of people seem to survive, although you can apparently get it twice and stuff like this. But, of course, the Chinese economy, after the crash in 2008, they pumped their economy up, chucked loads of money at it to keep it rolling, and because they did that, the Western powers were protected from their own malfeasance over their own stock markets. But, of course, the Chinese, far from being rewarded for their public spiritedness, are now going to have their own economy taken down. It's quite clear what Pompeo and these other people want to do. They want to take down the Chinese economy, which is absolutely bizarre and stupid if you think about it. If the Chinese economy goes down...
This is competition, isn't it?
It's warfare.
Market forces.
No, it's warfare. And, of course, warfare is competition. Of course it is. The question is, you've just got to win it.
Is it Kevin?
No, I think Martin is right. The American idea of competition does move into warfare. They don't distinguish between warfare and competition.
They want to dominate the world, we were hearing last week.
Yeah, and the Chinese are a particular, as I say, they openly say we've got to get them now, because if they carry on developing the way they are,
you know what, this reminds me of the attitude to Cuba in the 1960s.
Well, yes,
and the missile gap. They were saying, unless we have a nuclear war now, in the 1960s, they're going to overtake us in the number of nukes.
That's how mad these Dr. Strangeloves are.
Yeah, and the US has...
and they also provoked the Japanese into attacking them at Pearl Harbor. They just basically pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. They knew they would probably attack, and they actually knew that the attack was coming in, and they used it as a means to then drag themselves into the war and then dominate the whole region at the end of it. These people are very vicious, and they've got a track record of bad behaviour. It's not...
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Well, sticking with the Americans, we've got a very interesting stage, haven't we, in the Democratic nomination process, which is the Iowa and the New Hampshire caucuses, which apparently, maybe you can put me straight, either of you, that's...